So welcome back, it's me again, and we have a treat for you now, because a dear friend of mine, and I have to say, I think we worked out we've known each other over 30 years? Yeah, something like that. Okay, so we were contemporaries at Cambridge when we were doing our PhD, but Jamie Woodward is probably one of the world's leading geomorphologists. And at that point, you're going to look at me and go, what? So that's a person who studied the landform around us and the processes that create them. Jamie is based at Manchester University in the UK, and he has studied environmental change in the Arctic, the Mediterranean, and the Nile Delta. His research has also completely changed the way we understand microplastics, how they are sorted, how they're transported through our river systems, and how they're deposited in our oceans. And that's going to be the key part of his talk today. But he's also published two important books. One, The Ice Age, a very short introduction, and also co-authored with another friend of ours, Klaus Dobbs, The Arctic, a very short introduction, both published by Oxford University Press, and I recommend both of them. Jamie also has an amazing Twitter account. It's got over 80,000 followers. I suggest you follow him because it's not politics. What he actually puts up is incredibly cool stuff about the ice ages. So frozen mammoths, ancient trees, beautiful human artifacts, and sculptures found by archaeologists. And sometimes I just go onto his Twitter account and go, oh, like. So I suggest if you just want a little bit of distraction and you want to think about the last ice age and all that coldness during our heat waves, please feel free to follow him. So today he's going to take us on a journey to find out where all our plastic comes from, where it goes, and where it ends up. Jamie, drowning in plastic, mate.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very generous introduction. Delighted to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. See, Mark gets the cheek microphone. I get to hold this for an hour, and it weighs a ton. Okay, so I'll do my best. So, yeah, Mark gave me this title, Drowning in Plastic. What I'm going to be talking about are microplastics, one of the big environmental topics of the day. And my talk's in two parts. I want to share with you some research that we've done around the rivers around Manchester in the north of England, where I'm based at the university, and think about the wider significance of that work. I also want to talk a little bit about microplastics in the Czech Republic, and then in the second half, look at the policy implications and some of the media coverage of this work, because that's quite interesting, and it's relevant to sort of many of the debates we've been talking about today. So, drowning in plastic. This is a photograph that I took on one of the rivers near Manchester. It's actually the River Irwell, and after a flood event, big bits of plastic, milk bottles, Coca-Cola bottles. This is typical of many rivers across Western Europe after flood events. So we've got large amounts of plastic. That plastic it's unsightly, it's pollution, it's visible. And this is also related to the production of plastic, but what we do with it, how we dispose of it. Now, we can see that plastic. I'm going to be talking about microplastics today. Small plastic particles, the technical definition is smaller than 5 millimeters, so that's half a centimeter. That's actually quite big. You can see that plastic. But most of the plastics I'm talking about, you need a microscope to identify them. So smaller than the end of your pencil point, smaller than a millimeter, certainly. But many of these microplastics are smaller than half a millimeter. This slide shows microplastic fibers, microplastic fragments of different colors, some microbeads. I'll explain where they come from and where we see them in a moment. So we're going to focus on microplastics in rivers and in the ocean. Now, this work began because I was watching Blue Planet on the TV at home about 7 years ago, and David Attenborough was talking about all the microplastics in the oceans. Now, most of the science and the research on microplastics so far has focused very much on the marine environment in the oceans. So I started thinking, well, where are these microplastics coming from? They must be coming from rivers that drain big, dirty cities like Manchester. Manchester's a wonderful city, but it does have some polluted rivers. So wherever you have people, wherever you have industry, you have plastic. And any river systems in those cities and those towns will contain microplastics. So I thought, well, these rivers must be transporting microplastics to the ocean. Let's have a look to see how contaminated these rivers are. And let's see if we can estimate or calculate how much microplastics is moving from these rivers down to the ocean. And then let's see if we can do something about it. So the first part was exploratory. Now, just a few years ago, Greenpeace looked at microplastics in the Czech Republic, in Prague. They took samples in the Vltava River, but this survey wasn't very good. Greenpeace has actually spent lots of money doing snapshot surveys of lots of rivers around Europe and around the UK. And these surveys have been pretty useless, actually. Anybody here from Greenpeace? And I want to explain to you a little bit later why that is the case. They collected 6 samples on this river one afternoon, sent them back to a lab in Exeter in the UK, and found each sample is about 1 litre of water, so about the same size as many of the water bottles that you're drinking out of, and found a few plastic fragments in each one. So the good news is they didn't find very much microplastic. So maybe all the rivers in Eastern Europe and in Czechoslovakia are clean and free of microplastics. So that's a good news story. But what I want to show you later is what way they were sampling the wrong thing, and they need to do much more detailed analysis. So there's a project here for somebody to look at microplastics in Czech rivers. There's a big opportunity here to tackle some of the questions that I want to pose. But it's important that this research is beginning. So this is where I'm based. We're in the northwest of England. This is the city of Manchester, Liverpool, the Irish Sea. And what we wanted to do is shift the research agenda from the marine environment, or certainly complement that, to river catchments, to understand what was going on in river basins. So these rivers are quite small. We have a catchment area of about 1,500 square kilometers. We sampled 40 sites on the rivers to the north and the south of Manchester. But this is still the largest survey of microplastics in fresh waters anywhere in the world. So it was quite a comprehensive study. But what we wanted to do is, we wanted to establish, is there a problem with microplastic contamination in these rivers? And could we link these river catchments to the sea? Could we calculate how much microplastics was being transported downstream? So this work I did with a PhD student called Rachel Hurley, who's now working in Oslo, doing microplastic research full-time for the Norwegian Hydrological Institute, and a colleague of mine, James Rothwell. So we sampled in rural environments, we sampled down in the bright lights of Manchester city centre. We tried to capture a whole range of different environments. So I mentioned the Greenpeace survey. An important aspect of our work is how we take samples and where we take those samples. Now, we focus on the river beds, on the sediments and the microplastics that accumulate on the river beds. This is me and James Rothwell. We don't have to wear the same clothes when we do field work. We don't have a uniform, but it's just how it happened on the day. So we have a very sophisticated piece of equipment. We have an aluminium drum, and we push it into the riverbed. You can see the riverbed here is clear, and then we disturb it with a trowel, and the fine sediments come up into suspension. Any microplastics, we can then transfer them into a big container, take them to a laboratory, separate the plastics from the sediment, and count them. And the point I want to make here is, in terms of ecosystems, the quality of the river channel bed is really important. It's probably much more important than the microplastics actually in the water column, but we'll come back to that. So that's how we collect our samples, and I'll explain why that's important. So what did we find? Well, on the left-hand side there, if you look at that map, the bigger the circle, the more contamination. We found microplastics in every river. So in 2015, we discovered that UK riverbeds were contaminated with microplastics, and in some places they were very heavily contaminated with microplastics. We just didn't know that before. So the riverbeds themselves were contaminated with microplastics. What do we find? So we find fragments of plastic. These are the pink ones. These are fragments here. Different shapes, different sizes, different colors. We find microbeads. These are the circular ones. These are what we call primary microplastics. And we find lots of microplastic fibers from the washing of your clothes and my clothes, mostly from the fleeces worn by professors at the university, okay? So lots of fibers, fragments, and other things like glitter and bits of rubber. So we find mixtures of microplastic types, different sizes and different polymers. And in some places, like these locations here, we call these microplastic hotspots. We found very high levels of contamination. And in this study, we found the highest levels of contamination anywhere in the world. But I'll qualify that because not much research had been done at that point, but still these values were very high. Now, so these riverbeds were contaminated. Now, why does this matter? Why does the riverbeds contaminate with microplastics? Why should we care about this? Well, if you feed on the riverbed, or you live on the riverbed, or you reproduce on the riverbed, you're likely to ingest microplastics if that riverbed is contaminated with microplastics. So here we've got a fish, we've got a barbel at the bottom, we've got a swan. They're both foraging around on the riverbed, getting nutrients, organic material, macroinvertebrates from the fine sediments. If those fine sediments and the macroinvertebrates and the insects are contaminated with microplastics, they're much more likely then to be ingested and get into the food chain. So there's an ecological and environmental toxicological issue here. So there's lots of research now going on about to the extent to which microplastics are damaging the animals and the creatures that live in river systems and the oceans. But I'll come back to that. So that's one reason why it matters. And then there's some other reasons that I'll explain later. Now, we got quite lucky. After those samples we collected in 2015, in the winter of 15-16, we got extensive floods across the north of England. Big floods in Manchester. All these rivers had, particularly the north of Manchester, we had big flood events and significant flood events to the south of Manchester. So we went out, resampled all the sites. It was an opportunity. And we found that most of the microplastics had been washed away. About 80% of the microplastics had been washed downstream and they'd gone away. So we discovered a new process. The rivers will clean themselves. The microplastics get washed downstream. Now, the bad news is those microplastics end up in the ocean. So we thought, well, can we calculate how much of those microplastics have been washed downstream and see if we could contribute to our understanding of the microplastic load in the ocean, the importance of rivers, etc. It also posed interesting questions about if rivers will wash microplastics downstream, how do those rivers get contaminated in the first place? How are those microplastics replenished? Where are they coming from? And I'll come on to that later. So we published this paper in Nature Geoscience. It's microplastic contamination of riverbeds reduced by catchment-wide flooding. So we identified this new process. But what made that paper important is we were able to calculate how much microplastic had gone. So we're shifting scales here. We've got a microbead there. That's a portion of our channel bed. We can work out how much microplastic contamination per area of channel bed. And then we can extrapolate from different reaches. And we calculated how much microplastic was stored on the riverbeds in 2015 as opposed to early 2016. And then we just took those numbers away. We just worked out how much had gone. Made a few assumptions, but the numbers are robust and reasonable. And we came up with this big number. We calculated that 43 billion microplastic particles were flushed downstream off those channel beds in the winter of 15-16. And we thought, well, that seems like a big number, but is it reasonable? We had nothing to compare it to. So we then started looking, well, what about the global ocean? And there's a Dutch team led by Erik Sabiel who did a calculation a couple of years earlier. They'd looked at all the literature, and they came up with a number and said there were 4.85 trillion microplastic particles currently in the global ocean, suspended in the global ocean. That seems like a really big number. Now, I'm sure some of you have done the maths already, but this number is about 1% of that number. So could our puny little rivers in Manchester in a single winter account for 1% of the global inventory? No. So what our work showed is that rivers are really important suppliers of microplastics to the oceans. And they also showed that these current estimates of the ocean load of microplastics were severe underestimates, probably by an order of magnitude. And Erik Sabiel commented on our paper when it was published that I'm quite happy to see this number go up because we thought this was a serious underestimate. So this is a global problem. We've been working locally in Manchester, but thinking about the bigger picture. So key conclusion there is river systems are key suppliers of microplastics to the oceans. So that then got us thinking about, well, where are these microplastics coming from? What are the sources of the microplastics? And how do the microplastics get in the river? What are the entry points, and can we do anything about it? And if the rivers will flush the microplastics away, how are they getting replenished so quickly? Where are they coming from, and how are they getting onto the riverbeds? So This is an urban scene around Manchester, but it could be anywhere in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. You've got housing estates, housing developments, industry, river system here, and a wastewater treatment plant. So, microplastics come from domestic wastewater. When you have a shower or you do your washing, you will produce microplastics which will go into wastewater. Microplastics are produced by industry, by trade effluents, a variety of processes. Also produced by runoff from roads. You get the paint on the roads has plastic in it, tires wear down, brake dust wears down. All of this stuff ends up in the urban drainage system and should go to a wastewater treatment works and should be treated and should be extracted, okay? There's also potentially sources from agriculture. So when the wastewater treatment works are doing their job, the wastewater is treated and the nice clear blue water is then returned to our rivers to protect our ecosystems. But in the UK at the present time, this has nothing to do with Brexit. This has been going on for at least 2-3 decades. The privatized water companies have been dumping huge amounts of sewage. Are you familiar with that word? It's the same as another word that begins with S, but sewage is the polite way of saying it, okay? Been dumping huge amounts of untreated sewage into our rivers. And they've been making enormous profits. It's a £50 billion industry. They make huge profits. They pay their executives £millions bonuses. These are the major water companies in England. This is in 2020. This is in hours how much untreated wastewater they dumped in the rivers. United Utilities is my water company around Manchester, the northwest of England. They have one of the worst records. So we asked the question, if microplastics are transported under high flows, under floods, now water companies are allowed to discharge untreated wastewater when the rivers are in flood, so their plants don't get overwhelmed. But we know that the floods wash the microplastics away. So the water companies must be releasing microplastics in wastewater during dry weather. And that's the only way you can explain very high concentrations actually on the river beds. So this is a legal activity. So we haven't got a nice blue arrow there, we've got a brown one. Now, that river I just showed you is a river called the River Tame, but it could have picked any river around Greater Manchester. I just want to point out a couple of things. We've done some very detailed work here. Remember the work I showed you then in Prague, where Greenpeace took water samples? Well, we took water samples, and we found very low concentrations of microplastics, mostly fibers, just 1 or 2 or 3 microplastics per litre. Very similar values to the ones that were found in Prague. But at the same locations, when you look on the river channel bed, you find every kind of microplastic, and in some places in urban environments, we have values up to 140,000 microplastic particles for every kilogram of sediment, so 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more than you find in the water. So if you sample the water, you're going to miss most of the action, because most of the microplastics are stored on the channel bed, and in terms of their ecological significance, that's the worst place that they can be. So, we published another paper, and this is where it now gets political. It was some interesting science before with a global significance, but this is where it got political. And originally this paper was titled Acute Riverine Microplastic Contamination Due to Deliberate Releases, but we thought that was a bit too provocative. Avoidable releases of untreated wastewater. And a quote here says, "Here we show how untreated wastewater, which is basically sewage and everything else, laced with microplastics and raw sewage, is routinely discharged into river flows in the UK that are too low to wash the microplastics downstream." So basically, we're now using the microplastic as a tool to identify illegal activity by the water companies. So this is now it gets political, and it's become quite controversial. And there's been a lot of media coverage of this. This is me looking heroic, stood behind a Tesco's shopping trolley covered in wet wipes here in the River Tame. And so why this work is important is that currently in the UK, there's a big scandal about sewage dumping in rivers. This has linked the microplastic problem with the sewage scandal for the first time. They're one and the same problem. So treating the wastewater solves both problems. And the water companies don't like that because it's another problem that's now been put at their door. But it's another good reason why they need to treat the wastewater, and not just dump it in the rivers. So we did an animation to...
Microplastics in UK rivers, getting to the bottom of the problem. From the highest mountains to the depths of the ocean, scientists are finding microplastics everywhere they look. Most are practically invisible, no more than 0.5 millimetre wide. It can take hundreds of years for these microplastics to break down, and we're just beginning to uncover the scale of the damage they are causing in our natural world. These persistent particles can be especially harmful in rivers, where creatures ingest them, often hindering their growth and reproduction. Physical geographers from the University of Manchester examined 10 rivers around their city. Sampling and analysing riverbed sediments revealed shocking findings. Microplastics were pervasive in every river. At one site on the River Tame, they counted 130,000 microplastic particles for every kilogram of fine bed sediment. This turned out to be the highest concentration ever recorded. These discoveries took the UK Environment Agency and the water industry by surprise. How had such high concentrations of microplastics accumulated on riverbeds? After a winter of widespread flooding, the Manchester geographers returned to the rivers and resampled the sites. Most of the microplastics had been flushed away, demonstrating that floods were effective at cleansing the riverbeds, transporting microplastics downstream. If high river flows removed microplastics, how had the riverbeds become so heavily contaminated? It's long been known that microplastic particles are released from industrial cleaning processes, fibres are shed in their trillions when we wash our clothes, and car tyres wear to produce plastic dust. These microplastics accumulate in wastewater, and along with runoff and sewage, they enter the urban drainage network. To protect our waterways, this wastewater should be treated using processes that can remove up to 99% of the microplastic load. Untreated wastewater may only be released into rivers during extreme rainfall so that floods flush pollutants away. The only explanation for the record-breaking microplastic accumulations was illegal activity. They could only be explained by water companies routinely discharging untreated wastewater and sewage during dry weather. By highlighting that this microplastic pollution reflects poor wastewater management, the Manchester team were the first to link the sewage pollution scandal and the microplastic problem. An independent study in the Thames region, using entirely different methods, has also concluded that UK water companies routinely breached wastewater treatment regulations. Since publishing their research, the Manchester geographers have worked hard to share their findings, generating widespread media coverage and influencing policy developments at Westminster. This work helped to force a formal investigation into water company behaviour and build much-needed pressure on these companies to better protect our river and coastal environments. We must cut down on how much plastic waste we create. Until then, proper wastewater treatment is the most effective way of cleaning up our rivers and protecting our freshwater and marine ecosystems.
Thank you. So effective wastewater treatment, whether that's across anywhere in Europe, anywhere in North America, wherever it happens to be in the world, is really important for protecting the quality of our aquatic environments, because it's well established in the literature that wastewater treatment can remove 99% of the microplastics in wastewater. And when we find microplastics on the river channel bed, accumulating there under low river flows, it's a key indicator that that treatment isn't happening. So we're using it now as a tool to identify when the water companies are not doing what they should be doing. So this is when it's got political. Now, sometimes when you do a piece of research, the timing is really important. We published this research just over a year ago, in May 2021. At the time, this is Philip Dunn, who's an MP. He's the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee of the UK Parliament. This is an important committee in Westminster who looked at all aspects of the environment, from climate change, the biodiversity crisis. But he led an inquiry last year into the quality of rivers in England and Wales. So I gave evidence to that inquiry. We submitted our paper, and I did a presentation, demonstrated in the field how we take our samples, etc. So our work featured prominently in the report. So that's important. That doesn't happen very often, so we're really proud of that. And we're really proud of the fact that it's put additional pressure on the water companies to change their behaviour. Because a lot of people in the UK and elsewhere just weren't aware that this was happening, and it's been a big surprise that the water companies have been dumping untreated wastewater in our rivers for an extended period of time. So,
my Lord, first of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for
the House of Lords
bringing forward the amendments he has and for his commitment to review Schedule 3. That was something that I asked for in committee, and I'm delighted that he's going to do that. The new point that I want to ask is, has he been briefed on the latest research from the University of Manchester that has demonstrated a direct link between poor wastewater management and high levels of microplastic pollution in the United Kingdom? What is clearly happening is when we have these overflows, the microplastics are going out into the water system, and not only the rivers but into the sea. So we're actually negating a whole lot of good that the government have been trying to do in reducing microplastics. So we're just making, if this was not a bad situation before, my lords, it is now a really bad situation. On my noble friend's Amendment 6.
So that was the Earl of Caithness in the House of Lords last September, while the House of Commons were debating the new Environment Act. The new Environment Act is really important in the UK because it's post-Brexit. It's supposed to replace all the European Union regulations. But that's just an illustration of how this work has cut through at the highest level and is putting pressure on the water companies. And what's really interesting about the political debate is in the past, you'd be familiar that there's a big argument for bringing water companies back into public ownership. So they should be owned by the state. And that's often the left-wing view. Whereas the right-wing view is that these things should be in private ownership. There should be various privatized incentives for them to make profits and for them to do the job well. But this is cut right across the political spectrum in the UK, and the momentum for change is really now quite impressive and quite important. But it's not just the Green Party and the left-wing Labour Party. This has been led by many people in the Conservative Party, in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's what I call affluent effluent. They've seen river systems in the home counties and in the Cotswolds filled with sewage. And the hunting and the shooting and the fishing lobby have seen many of their rivers deteriorate. So there's a big consensus now for change. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the coming years. Now, latest update. In the UK, we have the Environment Agency, who is responsible for the quality of our rivers. And they're also responsible for monitoring what the water companies do. They're supposed to take samples and they'll monitor habitats. But they haven't been doing this properly for many years. We also have a regulator called Ofwat, who's supposed to also look after the way the water companies behave. They've been totally ineffectual. So last November, the water companies are now under investigation by the Environment Agency and by Ofwat. They're investigating water company behavior. There's a formal investigation going on. In May, the Environment Agency released a statement, and they said, our initial analysis of the information collected to date has confirmed there may have been widespread and serious non-compliance with the regulations. The criminal investigation to all 10 water companies is expected to take 2 years to complete. And just last week, 2 weeks ago, the end of June, we have a new body now, a new quango in the UK called the Office for Environmental Protection. That's to replace the European Union in terms of oversight. They are now investigating the Environment Agency and Ofwat for not doing their job. You couldn't make this up. Because the Environment Agency have been totally ineffective, Ofwat's been totally ineffective, they're investigating the water companies, and the new Office for Environment Protection is investigating them. And that's where we are right now. Okay, it's a mess, but it'll be interesting to see how this pans out in the next couple of years. So this is a global problem. That's a local squabble in the UK, okay, that will play itself out. But microplastics are present in rivers across the world. What we know now, this is really important work that was published in Nature just a couple of months ago, showing wastewater from Northwest Europe, from here, from the North Sea, wastewater from the eastern part of North America, the ocean currents are taking that wastewater to the Arctic. So the Arctic Ocean and Arctic sea ice is now contaminated with microplastics, which comes from wastewater that should have been treated in wastewater treatment plants, okay? So those local studies have a global significance. So rather like the debates about carbon, acid rain in the past and what have you, this is transboundary pollution. So there's a collective need for all of us to change our behavior. This is a recent report from the European Environment Agency. I won't go through this, a lot of detail on here, but it says, over 40 million tons of microplastics have accumulated on the world ocean floor. About 8% of European microplastics released to oceans are from synthetic textiles, often from fast fashion, washing synthetic clothes. That just goes straight into wastewater, goes out into rivers, and eventually ends up in the ocean. What can we do about it? Can we do something positive? Well, use natural fibers instead of synthetic ones, for example. There's various suggestions on here. The most important one is proper wastewater treatment. Now, as the point I made in the animation, ideally we should use less plastic and we should make less plastic waste. But me being pragmatic, that isn't going to happen anytime soon. That's a long-term objective. Plastic waste is projected to double over the next 3 decades. So at the moment, the best strategy we have to protect our water environments is to keep microplastics out of rivers by treating wastewater. So, rivers are the main supplier of microplastics to the oceans. That's quite clear now. There are other sources, but the rivers are really important. If you want to tackle the marine microplastic problem that David Attenborough talked about in The Blue Planet all those years ago, we must keep microplastics out of rivers. So, I think this is important for a whole range of reasons, but also it poses fundamental questions about our consumption of material, the production of waste, and our relationship with the environment, and what we want to do with that, and how we treat river basins and the oceans. So the plastic issue is part of a much broader debate about our relationship with the natural world and whether we want to change that. So that's a good point to finish, I think, and I just want to acknowledge my colleagues and PhD students and master's students at the Department of Geography at the University of Manchester who've helped me in some really exotic locations collect a lot of these samples and think about these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. So I apologize, Jamie, that I get the really cool headset and you get the microphone, but I have been up here for 4 hours already, so, you know, I'm keeping going. So again, we would like to open this up for questions because Jamie is really at the forefront of science and looking at this. So, hands. Oh, there's one here. We've got microphone. There's one here, if that's okay. And for me, what is exciting is that this is what science is about. Sometimes you do some science, you don't know where it's going to lead, and suddenly this research of Jamie's has had major political impact because something has been found and there is an issue. And I love the fact that you're now able to prove that water companies have illegally been dumping wastewater.
You mentioned about most of the microplastics found in the rivers and the oceans comes from the sewage and the water waste from some industries. So I was wondering if at any point the landfills have also been studied and the fact that the groundwater gets contaminated by what's in the landfill. Is there a way, has that been studied as well? And is there like a significant number of microplastics getting to waterways through landfills?
So landfills as a source of microplastics, it hasn't been studied in detail. And one of the things, actually, when we published our paper last year, United Utilities, our water company, wrote to me, a fairly intimidating letter, trying to undermine our research and argue against it. And they said, oh, you didn't sample the recycling plants, for example. They didn't mention landfills. That's a potential source. There are, in river catchments, you know, of all sizes, there are multiple sources. But what I'm interested in urban environments, you have to think about, okay, there's a source of plastic here. How does that plastic get into the river? You've got to get the plastic from the source and into the river. Now, if a landfill site is being actively eroded by a river, that could move microplastics in there. Now, if you've got really very fine microplastics, there's a whole area of research now in nanoplastics, really tiny microplastics. They could move, we know that they could move in groundwater. But there are multiple sources. But I think what we've shown is that perhaps the most important source or the most important entry point is through these overflows and these wastewater treatment plants. And that is something we can do something about. But there are multiple sources. And we're still trying to fully understand them. And particularly in urban environments with a long history, there are multiple challenges. And we do have a river system, the River Tame. We have a landfill site that's being eroded by the river. And it's a real challenge. What do we do with that? So, but it's a source of all sorts of things as well as plastic. The other big question is to what extent are like Coca-Cola bottles or other plastic items that you can see, do they break down into smaller plastics? Now, that's another argument that's been put to me. And what we see is that the microplastics we see in the bed have come into the river as microplastics. We find lots of big plastic as well, but plastic's really robust. One of the success stories, plastic's such a wonderful material, is it lasts a very long time. So we don't think fragmentation of bigger plastic items is a major source of microplastics. It probably is when they get washed down to the ocean and they have a longer period of time to break down, but they're not in the rivers long enough to actually break down. Everything gets flushed out. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, can I see more hands? There's one over here. Where's the microphone? The gentleman there with the sunglasses.
Hello. You and your team has obviously done a lot of research in the pollution of rivers with microplastics. But when you see most documentaries or articles that are putting light to this subject, it's concerning the ocean, and that this and it's suggesting that this pollution is coming mostly from these trash islands of microplastics. How does your research fit into that image concerning the pollution of the oceans?
You mean like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and that kind of thing?
I know that has been debunked, but you know, the large waste plants that are leaving the macroplastics in the ocean.
There's a macroplastics, that's the big plastic items that we can see, plastic bottles, other plastic items. River systems move huge amounts of macroplastic to the ocean as well, huge amounts of plastic litter. But in the oceans, there are fishing nets, paint off tankers and that kind of thing. There are sources of plastic in the oceans itself. But I think it's accepted now that the key way that, actually what's interesting is this science is moving really quickly. Now, a few years ago, we didn't really understand that microplastics move by the wind. Now, that's an important process as well, particularly in arid and semi-arid environments. Microplastic particles are now blown by the wind. But river systems are the main way that microplastics move from the continents to the oceans. And that's plastics of all sizes. But we don't have accurate numbers yet in terms of, is that 60% or 70%? That will change over time. It will change by continent. Southeast Asia has a huge problem with plastic waste, microplastics and macroplastics. The South China Sea, for example, is the most microplastic contaminated marine environment in the world. So those big South Asian rivers draining those great big mega cities have a huge plastic problem. So there's a distinctive geography to this. And when we put these numbers on it, that will vary from different parts of the world. So it's hard to be sure about that, but rivers are key. What I would say, rivers are really important. And we have control of what goes into rivers in terms of how we behave and how we treat wastewater. So there is something positive we can do about that. Of course, we need to use less plastic and stop throwing it away. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in short, based on your research, you're confident in saying that most of the pollution in oceans are basically coming from rivers?
In terms of plastics, the majority of it, yes. But there are important sources on the oceans themselves. I'm not saying they aren't, but I think the rivers are the dominant source.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Jamie, I'm going to open that question up slightly because we're talking about Western Europe, Britain, where we should be treating our wastewater. We have regulations to do it. We're just not doing it because of profit. What's happening in other countries where literally if you can actually treat the water and make it drinkable, that's lucky. But I mean, are we missing huge sources of pollution around the world?
Well, wherever there are people and whether there's industry, there will be plastic. And yeah, I mean, if you asked anybody in the UK, think, oh yeah, we have a world-class wastewater treatment infrastructure, and it's broken. So, okay, so I don't know what the picture is across the rest of Europe. It will be mixed. In some places, I think the wastewater treatment will be very good. In other places, it will be patchy. So wherever the wastewater treatment is substandard, lots of microplastics will be going through the system. Lots of microplastics will be bypassing the system. So it's hard to put numbers on that. There's a distinctive geography. But what we should try and do is, and it's what we call a wicked problem. We know that effective wastewater treatment, all the stages, can remove about 99% of the microplastic load. And then that ends up in what we call sewage sludge, organic sludge. And in the past, what do we do with that sludge? Well, in the past, we used to incinerate it, we used to burn it, but we can't do that anymore because that creates air pollution, and Mark doesn't like that, okay? We used to take barges out to the ocean and we used to dump it on the ocean floor. we can't do that anymore because that's not a good idea. So we spread it on agricultural land. Okay, so, and we know now that our river systems have been contaminated with microplastics in the UK for 60 years, since the Second World War. This isn't a new problem. This is just a problem we've only recently become aware of. So rivers have been contaminated with plastics for as long as we have had plastics. And we've had heavy contamination in urban environments in Western Europe for probably 5-6 decades. That means that sewage sludge contaminated with microplastics has been spread on agricultural land across Europe for 5 and 6 decades. Okay, so that's something else to worry about. But I would argue that until we use less plastic or come up with a really clever technology to extract those microplastics, it's much better to spread sewage sludge, even if it's got microplastics in it, on agricultural land than it is to discharge it into the heart of the aquatic environment so it accumulates on riverbeds and makes the whole bottom environment toxic. But that's an interesting debate to have.
So can I ask, is microplastics a very Western construct? So for example, because we have fleeces and we have artificial clothes, or are we, because we're washing our clothes?
We live on a plastic planet. Plastics are global. Plastic pollution is a huge problem in China, in Southeast Asia, South America. Wherever you have people, we have plastics. Yeah, to a greater or lesser extent. But we all, probably everybody, is there everybody here? Anyone in this room who's wearing entirely natural fibers now? Could you stand up? Okay.
Couple of people thinking they are, which is
good. Fantastic. Good. But it's the minority, okay?
Okay, are there more questions for Jamie? Come on. Yes, there's one here. Yes, sorry.
I already got the microphone. Thank you for the lecture, first of all. And
thank you.
Yeah, I think you just answered my question because I was about to ask, how do we protect our rivers? And I think you said that, like, mostly it's because the wastewater treatment plants just don't treat the water properly. So I just wanted to ask about, like, better technologies, but maybe there aren't necessary at all.
Well, it's interesting. Ideally we could come up with some magic techno fix, but all we're asking is these wastewater treatment technologies have been in practice since the 19th century. It's not rocket science, and some of them were actually developed in Manchester. So just treat the wastewater. So it's scandalous that isn't happening. Now, occasionally the plants get overwhelmed, but when they get overwhelmed, it's usually because there's a flood event or there's really heavy rainfall and lots of urban runoff. But when that happens, the plastics get washed downstream. And of course, they end up in the ocean. Ultimately, that's not good. But for most of the time, we don't want microplastics sitting on the channel bed for the whole of the summer when the river systems are biologically active, when the fish are spawning, when everything's feeding, and we know those microplastics will be stored there until the next flood and they can move all through the food chain. So that is bad. Okay. The other way that we protect our rivers is not just treating wastewater, it's about having good environmental regulators who take regular samples and monitor the behaviour of the water companies and monitor the behaviour of industry. That isn't happening in the UK because the Environment Agency, we thought was a world-leading organisation. The leadership of that agency has been poor. They've been focused on being carbon neutral. That's important. But the UK Environment Agency, whether it's carbon neutral or not, it makes a tiny impact on the UK's carbon balance. They've also been focused on flooding because the government's thrown lots of money at flooding and Boris Johnson was embarrassed on a floodplain about 4 years ago. But they've totally dropped the ball on river water quality and river habitats. Their budgets have been cut, but their leadership has also set their priorities in other places. So the water companies have been operating in an unregulated environment. And pollution is spectacularly profitable. We know that. It's a simple business model. Treating that wastewater is expensive. Let's dump as much as it can in the river because nobody's going to tell us to stop. We're in that situation now, and it's scary. And everyone in the UK has this assumption that we've got world-leading standards and world-leading water companies, everything's fine. Well, that isn't the case. They're ripping everybody off. Sorry, was that a bit of a rant?
No.
Or did I answer your question?
You're allowed to rant.
Yeah.
Hey, look, if you can't.
Is anybody here from United Utilities, by the way?
If you can't rant at a festival, when can you rant? I'm also going to make it worse for you and for all of you because, of course, the water companies don't filter down to very small sizes. So all those pharmaceuticals, so the things like aspirin, paracetamol, hormones, all of that ends up into our water, our wastewater. It goes to sort of the waste treatment. However, their filters are slightly larger than them. So all of those pass through the water, and your clean drinking water and your bottled water has lots of really interesting chemicals in there, which includes hormones and the paracetamol and all of the other stuff that we have in very small quantities. But the interesting thing is we don't know how they interact with each other when you drink them. And we found, and this is work by Brunel University, that fish are already being affected quite severely by the combination of the chemicals.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting debate going on in the UK at the moment, because one of the things the water companies always say is, well, the river systems are now in a better state than they've ever been since the Industrial Revolution. And actually, recent work has actually shown, well, actually, in the last few decades, we now have problems with antibiotics, with COVID, with microplastics, with what we call emerging contaminants or contaminants of emerging concern. And they weren't present in the Industrial Revolution. So there's a whole different suite of problems now. So you can't make that simple assumption that the rivers are better than they've ever been. That isn't the case. But, you know, that's a really important point.
Well, I thought I'd just make it worse for you, Jamie.
No, it's...
We're a cheerful bunch here today. Right. Other questions? Hands. Can I see them? Please. Anybody? Come on, this is Jamie. You'll never get him again. I'm going to ask one final question then, so you can then have a bit of a rest before we go on to climate anxiety. Jamie, how would you solve these issues? How would you actually go about... You are now Prime Minister, because we haven't got one. So you're now Prime Minister. How would you solve these issues?
Well, these issues aren't simple. And one of the other things the water companies say is that we inherited a Victorian infrastructure in terms of sewage and overflows, etc. But there's two things. First of all, you need to have an effective environmental regulator, an environment agency, who takes regular water samples and monitors what the water companies are doing, because water companies tell lies, okay? We've had a situation since 2010 where the water companies report their own pollution incidents, okay? They're responsible. They mark their own homework. So you need an effective, independent, well-resourced environmental body who monitors the quality of river habitats and river water quality and has the resources and the power to do that. And then you also need the power to fine the water companies when they breach those environmental regulations. Hit them in the pocket, because that's the only thing that makes them respond. So you need an effective regulator then that is prepared to fine them and make them put more of their profits into investment to improve their infrastructure. So they've got... What happens in the UK? If somebody wants to build a housing estate, say, yeah, build a housing estate. Nobody ever asks the question, is the wastewater treatment plant, does it have enough capacity? They ask that question 10 years later when it's become overwhelmed. They need to invest in advance, and we need to have better planning. So we need to have better infrastructure, but that requires investment, but better policing and better regulation.
On that note, I'm going to vote for Jamie, and I'd like to say thank you very much for the audience. And Jamie, brilliant, as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.